Sa akda ni Rizal na The Indolence of the Filipino ay pinabulaanan niya ang nosyon ng mga Espanyol na likas na katangian o kaugalian ng mga Pilipino ang katamaran, na siya raw punot dulo ng kahirapan sa ating inang bayan. Ayon nga sa akda ni Rizal, indolence in the Philippines is a chronic malady, but not the hereditary one. The Filipinos have not always been what they are. Hindi likas na katangian ng mga Pilipino ang pagiging tamad. Naging indolent lamang ang ilang Pilipino dahil sa impluwensya ng mga Espanyol sa iba't ibang kadahilanan na bunga ng pagsakop ng mga Espanyol sa ating bayan. Kaugnay nito, upang mas lubos na pabulaanan ang nosyon na tamad ang mga Pilipino at kaya mahirap ang ilang Pilipino ay dahil sa tamad sila, ay ating kakapanayamin si Ginoong Ferlito Banaya, isang barbero at Pilipinong manggagawa, at si Profesor Vincent Gerald Ramos, isang profesor ng Economics sa Universidad ng Pilipinas, Baguio, at nagtapos ng BS Economics sa UP Diliman, Masters in Public Policy sa Hertie School sa Germany, at kasalukuyang isang doctoral candidate sa Research Training Group of Dynamics of Demography, Democratic Processes, and Public Policy sa Humboldt University of Berlin sa Hertie School sa Germany. Susuriin, aalamin at bibigyang linaw ang mga mahahalagang usapin. X4A Files Interviews presents Tamad o Kulang sa Oportunidad. Narito tayo ngayon sa San Fernando City Public Market upang kapanayamin si Ginoong Ferlito Banaya, 51 taong gulang at isang barbero.
Magandang araw po kuya. Pakisabi po yung pangalan po ninyo,
Ferlito Banaya,
taon,
51 na.
ano po yung trabaho niyo?
Barbero talaga.
Gaano na po kayo katagal sa trabaho po nito?
Nag-umpisa ako year 2000. 22 years na. Ayun. No.
Opo. Bali, nagsimula pa kayo noong 2000 hanggang ngayon po. Bali, 22 years po. May iba pa po kayong naging trabaho bukod po sa pagiging barbero?
Ay, wala na yun. Wala.
Anong oras po kayo nagigising kada araw?
Tapos 4, madaling araw. Oh. Tapos, alas 6 ako alis sa bahay.
Tapos magsisimula po kayo ng trabaho
Ito,
sa
alas
anong
7.
oras?
Nagugupit na.
Anong oras naman po kayo umuwi?
Alas 6.
Anong oras naman po kayo natutulog?
Alas 8.
Bali po, nagtatrabaho po kayo ng 11 na oras sa isang araw po.
Oh.
So, ito lang po ba yung trabaho nyo o may iba pa po kayo source of income? Yung asawa nyo po?
Doon sa bahay. Housekeeper.
Housewife po yung
Housewife.
asawa nyo po. Sa tingin nyo po, sapat po ba yung kinikita nyo araw-araw?
Medyo kulang pa kunti.
Bakit po?
Kaya nag-overtime ako. Matungal pa na yun.
Bakit po para sa inyo hindi po sapat yung kita po ninyo?
Mahal naman bilihin.
Tama po. So, bali po yun. Hindi po sapat yung kinikita nyo po dahil sa taas rin po ng bilihin nyo. Na-try nyo na po bang magpalit ng uwi or yung mag-overtime po?
Oo, wow. Hanggang pa, 6:30, gano'n. Overtime. Kailangan eh.
Bakit nyo po kailangan mag-overtime?
Para kung dagdag ng palengke, gano'n.
Para po kahit pa paano madagdagan po yung kita.
Madagdagan yung kita.
Opo.
First of all, we have to differentiate between what we mean by informal sector, right? Because internationally, there is a distinction between those employed in the informal sector, right, and those who are informally employed outside the informal sector. Right? So when we say informal sector, of course, this also includes your own account workers, right? Yung mga street vendors natin, right? They're all employed in the informal sector. Um, because the informal economy pertains to, or the informal sector pertains to firms who are not duly recognized firms and entities, right? But on the other hand, you have informally employed people outside the informal sector, which means that merong mga informally employed even within the formal sector, right? So, for instance, duly registered businesses, right? The formal economy, formal firms, right? May be hiring some people informally, right? Especially those, for instance, in service related tasks, right? And you also have households, right? Households who are hiring, for instance, domestic workers, right? These are, of course, not part of the informal sector because they're households, no? And so there is a distinction between those. And in theory, ganoon dapat dinedefine or binibilang kung gaano kalaki yung informal economy mo. But the Philippines, like many developing countries, they don't have perfect tools to count how many are actually part of this informal economy. Um, we have the labor force surveys, right? And we use that to proxy how many and how large the informal economy is. And it's not a perfect tool because some provisions are not present in this survey, right? For instance, the nature of the employer and on the benefits received by the employee, all of these provisions are necessary to understand uh, sino yung mga informally employed talaga, given that strict definition. That said, using proxy indicators in the Philippines, using the labor force survey, a majority of our total employment is in the informal sector, right? That's about 60% according to latest estimates by Dole and PSA, and that translates to about 23 million or so. And because the informal economy is not covered by minimum wage regulations, and technically they are, right? But in the sense that, since the transactions are informal, right, one can't really um, uh, uh, litigate that, or one can't really, cover that in minimum wage laws because wala namang formal employer-employee relationship in many of these informal contracts and informal arrangements. Um, then one could expect most of it to be below minimum wage earners, right? So around 23 million or so, mostly below minimum wage. It's always difficult, diba, to uh, to give a specific amount, no, because there's a large heterogeneity across households, no. So um, what the PSA does is it defines a poverty line, right? So yung poverty line is the objective measure of poverty, and anyone below, right, the threshold would count as someone who's poor, right, or as a poor household, and those above are non-poor households. Although it's problematic and it's questionable because even those above, right, even those above the threshold may still experience, poverty like symptoms, so to speak, right? So, and the PSA and the NEDA would define that threshold based on the family income and expenditure survey, and currently it's around 12,000 pesos per month for a household of five, right? So in 2021, around 24%, right? One in four households are falling below this threshold, right? But this is not the only measure of poverty, right? There's also measures of self-rated poverty, of you know subsistence poverty, which is even a more intense threshold. So around 12,000 pesos per month for a family of five. One can't really, and one shouldn't really say that well, this is maayos na buhay, right? Because it's always normative to say what is maayos and what is not, right? And it's always difficult to conceptualize normative terms such as this, because how does one define what is maayos and what is not? Right? So, does it mean that the household is debt-free? Dapat ba walang utang ang household para maging maayos yung buhay nito? But, even the top earning households in the country would still have debt, right? Does it mean that the household can meet all basic food necessities? And then that would be the poverty line, right? That's 12,000 pesos according to PSA. Or does it mean that the household is able to accumulate wealth? Dapat ba meron na siyang assets? So, diba? So we have to, first agree on what we think by and how we understand what maayos is, right? Or maluwag is, or whatever term, right, one wants to use. But in any case, the larger your distance is from the poverty threshold, right, the 12,000 pesos, then the more likely it is that the living standards of your household are increasing, right?
Sa kawalan po ng sapat po na kita, ano po yung sa tingin ninyo yung kailangan nyo po at ng kapwa po nating Pilipino para po kahit pa paano ay umunlad po yung buhay natin?
Kailangan sumikap, gano'n.
So para po sa inyo, kailangan po mas magsumikap.
So,
Bukod pa po dito, ano pa po yung tingin nyo na nawala or kulang sa atin na kailangan po nating makuha para po kahit pa paano umunlad po yung buhay natin?
kailangan sana may ibibigay ng kirno para may puhunan.
So, yun din po yung susunod po sana na tanong. So, para po sa inyo, kailangan po ng puhunan
Oo.
or ng
May pangdagdag.
or ng additional program po para sa mga ordinaryong manggagawa para po mas umunlad po yung buhay natin. Bakit po sa tingin ninyo kailangan po ninyo at ng kapwa natin Pilipino yung ganito po, puhunan, programa para sa mga ordinaryong manggagawa?
So, kailangan talaga, sir,
Bakit po?
kulang yung
So,
kita.
so yun po. So, para po sa inyo, kailangan po ng additional na tulong.
Business na lang doon sa bahay. Benefits.
Para mas makasama po yung pamilya.
Para makatulong naman.
Kung bibigyan po kayo ng oportunidad para po kahit pa paano is ma-improve or maging sapat po yung kita nyo,
Oo.
tatanggapin nyo po ba ito?
Oo. Business namin sa amin, sa bahay. Patayo kami ng store, gano'n. Meron.
Para po mas bumuti po yung
Bumuti yung
That's particularly a relevant question because we have just come from a period of high unemployment, right, during COVID. But so from a supply and demand framework, a simple supply and demand diagram that we're all familiar with, pag mataas ang unemployment rate mo, it's a signal of two things, right? Either of two things. Number one, employment prospects are low, which means that labor demand is low, right? Wala masyadong nagde-demand ng labor, maybe because product markets are also down. Right? On the other hand, labor supply is high, right? So, mababa ang nagde-demand, mataas ang magsusupply ng labor. Right? And so that results in high unemployment. And the larger the mismatch is between that supply and demand, the higher that unemployment is. So that's the main implication of of a high unemployment rate, right? Which means your supply, your labor supply far far exceeds your labor demand, right? But from a search and matching model framework, high unemployment rates may also mean more frictions in the labor market, right? So difficulties in moving from one job to another, from one state to another, right? From how do you go from unemployed to employed, or from inactivity to employed? And the more frictions there are in the labor market, uh, uh, frictions meaning, for instance, the time it takes to find another job, right? Or the time it takes to upskill yourself to be able to transition to another sector or another occupation, for instance. And the more frictions there are in the labor market, also including institutional barriers, then the more difficult it is to actually find jobs and to actually make these transitions from one state to another. So high unemployment rates basically affect not only those who are unemployed, of course kasama na yon, 'di ba? Yung mga walang trabaho, obviously they get affected in terms of purchasing power, in terms of job security, and also in terms of future life outcomes, right? But also among the employed, right? Kapag ka mataas yung unemployment rate mo, which signals, high uncertainty in the economy, it can also affect those who are working, right? Those who are working may not want to shift jobs even if they really wanted to, because they know that prospects are low. And they also have, adverse effects in future life outcomes, right? There are many studies pointing to what they call a scarring effect, right? That yung mga graduates ng pumapasok during a recession have lower future wage trajectories and family formation outcomes. So they have less children, they marry later, they have kids later, they have lower overall fertility, and so forth. So these future late life outcomes are potentially affected by conditions upon labor market entry, right? Ano yung lagay ng labor market noong pumasok sila sa trabaho. And so ibig sabihin, kahit na nakapasok ka ng trabaho during the pandemic, right? That might have future effects on your labor market and family formation outcomes. So that's the idea of scaring effects, right? So I just wanted to illustrate that when you have a high unemployment rate, it affects not only those who are unemployed, but also among those who are employed as well. Well, it's a very relevant question right now, especially because you really have inflation skyrocketing to record highs, right? But in theory, so when you have inflation and you have an overall increase in prices, then it weakens, of course, the purchasing power of the household, right? So basically, your 100 pesos before can buy less quantity of goods and services in the market right now, right? So your 100 pesos last year and 100 pesos this year, magkaiba siya ng mabibili. An indirect effect of this, of course, is central banks would try to respond, right, to try to tame down inflation by raising interest rates. And when you raise interest rates, of course, it raises the cost of borrowing money. And that encourages savings, right, for ordinary Filipinos, but also um, it becomes more difficult, right, to gain money, right, or to obtain credit, for instance, for anything that the household might need, right? Um, so you have weaker purchasing power of the household, right? You have a higher cost of borrowing money. So kung kinakailangan mong manghiram, for instance, to pay for the education of your children, or to pay for the healthcare of your family, then the cost of borrowing that money is now much higher. Right? And it then pushes minimum wage earners to even more vulnerable positions, because your 500 pesos in minimum wages, in minimum wage, if it does not increase, right, then you're able to buy less. Right? So it really pushes minimum wages earners to the edge, if not below that threshold that we were talking about earlier. Right? So inflation is concerning, right, especially for lower income households, because it really pushes them to the edge, right? If you don't have sufficient uh, savings and social assistance mechanisms, as in the case for many low income households, nagkakaproblema talaga at nahihirapan, nasa-squeeze talaga yung working class families natin, so to speak. Um, so in theory, yes, they're important, but also the question is, it depends. Well, the answer is it depends. Right? It depends on which opportunities, programs, and benefits that you're referring to, because during recessionary periods, the programs, right, should revolve around really social protection. Right? How do you protect the consumption patterns of your households such that they don't fall below poverty, or that they don't fall into poverty? How do you prevent the transitions to subsistence poverty, for instance, right? And so when you talk about periods of recessions, it's really how do governments protect uh, the purchasing power of households, and how do you prevent them from being in a worse off positions? So that's really the importance of governments, um, programs, especially during difficult periods, right? Because during a recession, if it's not government who will give stimulus, for instance, or social assistance to the poor, no one else will, right? No one else will. And so that really is the importance of these programs. Yung question is a bit complicated because meron two components to the question, right? And pwedeng magkaiba yung sagot nila uh, pwedeng magkaiba yung sagot nila sa isa't isa, right? Your first question is, what's causing unemployment? Bakit walang trabaho ang ilang Pilipino? And of course, there are many reasons to that. Number one, labor demand is low, right? Labor supply is high, competition is high. But also, uh, frictions in the labor market also explain unemployment. But the second question is, bakit hindi umuunlad yung buhay ng ibang Pilipino? It's to some extent normative, but also there is a stagnation in living standards, which is true, right? Which is something empirically documented. Um, and there might be different causes in stagnation in living standards. Ano yung ibig sabihin nun? Kapag flat yung kanilang living standards, ibig sabihin, hindi umuunlad, hindi ka nagpo-progress from one state to another, right? But constant ka lang, steady ka lang, right? Yan ang ibig sabihin ng stagnation in living standards. But the causes of that might be totally different, right? So here in this case, you can point to more political answers to this, right? Including inequality, right? It's really the widening gap between the rich and poor, right? Inequality has been growing, right? And it's even a more relevant problem as societies develop. But also, it might also be because of political constraints, right? And so you can point to corruption, you can point to political dynasties, you can point to all these, political economy reasons, because eh, if governments are not able to really support, right, the trajectory, then it becomes more difficult to really climb up, right, that social ladder. And stagnation in living standards are it's very unlikely that it's due to the workers, right? Because these are people who are working, right? Nagtatrabaho naman sila. Um, nag uh, uh, Nagpapaaral naman sila. So I mean, in other words, your household is functioning in the best way that it knows how to, right? But if there is stagnation in living standards, must be because of some other cause. It really reforms that aim at increasing yung kanilang social protection and job security, right? And job security is so very important because, and job security does not only pertain to those working in the formal sector, right? We have to start thinking about how do we introduce tenets and pillars of job security even among informal economy workers. Okay? So for instance, anong largest problem, ano yung, not largest, but ano yung isang malaking problema noon in the informal sector? You have domestic workers, right? Yung ating mga kasambahays na some are underpaid, right? Some don't have leaves, and some don't, basically some don't have tenure, right? Nahihirapan silang mag-file ng kaso sa mga employers nila if magkaroon ng conflict. And then what happened a few years ago, I think like a couple of years ago, a decade ago or so, you have the kasambahay law, right? Passed, the kasambahay law becoming law. And what it does is it sort of gives structure to this largely informal arrangement of being a household helper, right? It sets some standards, it sets some rules, right, as to how employers, how households should govern that relationship. Um, and so they're still, in most part, not part of the formal sector because it's still a largely informal arrangement. But but the ideally, right, if that law is being followed, then your household helpers are supposedly having the same level or comparable levels of social protection and job security with those employed in the formal sector. So we need more programs like this, right? How do we expand provisions of social protection and job security to those outside the formal sector? Because they're the ones who really need it the most, right? We have to reconsider and question the purpose and the function of contractualization, for instance. It's really pointless, right? Meant to it's really meant as a cost saving mechanism of the firm, right? So paano mo matanggal ang contractualization? You raise the cost of hiring workers in a contractual manner in the same way na magiging indifferent si firm between hiring a worker contractually and fixed term, right? So dapat lahat ng meron ng fixed term, lahat ng fixed term at lahat ng permanent pare-pareho, right? So that's one way to go about contractualization, but also, for instance, having manpower agencies. They're really what I call value extractors in the economy. Right? They add no real value, no real value to the search and matching process, but they get what 10 to 20% of wages. Then it's really questionable. And so it's really about understanding and rebalancing the structure and the distribution of power right now between workers and the firm. Unionization, collective bargaining, increasing the bargaining power of workers both at the firm and industry level. These are steps towards that rebalancing of power, right? And so it's really necessary because we can't always focus on always rallying increase minimum wage, increase minimum wage. It's so tiring. No? It's not the only channel by which one can uplift the living standards of Filipinos. I mean, of course, minimum wages are important, and they are they really affect the lowest income classes of society, right? But that's not the only way, right? And so apart from rallying for increased minimum wages, which are necessary in my opinion, it's really about that rebalancing of power. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same answer that I gave in the previous one. It's really government reforms that increase social protection and job security, and how do you extend those social protection and job security conditions to those who are not working in the formal sector, right? And um, how does one do that? It's really to start and to more proactively formalize the economy. And by formalize the economy doesn't necessarily mean you know, take everyone out of the informal and put them to the formal, right? It's not necessarily the case, but it's really bringing what we know to be formal economy conditions, leaves, benefits, PhilHealth, SSS, etc. How do you bring those into the informal economy? And that has been the approach, I think, in many developing countries, and that could be, a better approach to doing so, rather than taking them out of informal occupations and bringing them to formal occupations, because the informal economy will always be there, and as a developing country, it's difficult to uproot people from that class, right, or from the informal economy. But how do you afford them, right? Social protection and job security. It's really, yeah, the cliche answer is formalize, or try to formalize that sector.
Kuya, ano po yung mararamdaman ninyo kapag may nagsabi po sa inyo na ganyan or ganito po yung kalagayan ng ilang Pilipino kasi po tamad po tayo.
Hindi tama ng Pilipino. Masipag.
Bakit po para sa inyo masipag ang mga Pilipino?
Oo nga. Kasi araw-araw silang nagtatrabaho eh.
Di ba po? Kahit po mainit, ganyan, or minsan nga po, di ba, kahit may bagyo, or may sakana, nagtatrabaho pa
Sa
rin.
akin nga eh, kahit may bagyo, pupunta pa ako.
Opo. Bali po,
Tulog ako sa Nagilian.
di ba po, parang kahit po mainit or kahit anong mangyari, nagtatrabaho pa rin po yung
Kailangan talaga.
Given po yung sagot po ninyo kanina, masipag po ang mga Pilipino, hindi po sila tamad.
No.
Paano po kapag may nagsabi sa inyo na kaya hindi umuulan ang mga Pilipino dahil tamad sila? Sang-ayon po ba kayo rito?
Hindi. Sipag mga Pilipino. Sipag sila.
Sa tingin niyo po, importante po ba na ipaalam po natin sa kapwa nating mga Pilipino na at sa mga foreigners po na hindi tamad ang mga Pilipino?
Oo.
Bakit po?
Para ako ano eh. Hindi tamad ang mga Pilipino, sabi ng mga foreigner.
Para po hindi tayo minamaliit.
Para hindi minamali ang mga tao dito.
Para po sa huling tanong, bakit po sa tingin niyo tamad o hindi tamad ang mga Pilipino? Bakit po para sa inyo hindi tamad ang mga Pilipino?
Masipag sila.
Bakit po?
Araw-araw silang tatrabaho na malabas. Kailangan.
Kumbaga po, dahil po sa hirap ng buhay.
Oo. Kailangan magtrabaho talaga.
Kaya hindi po tamad yung mga Pilipino kasi binibigay po nila yung makakaya nila.
Ang kaya nila. Oo.
Ano po yung tingin niyo na kailangan po ng mga bagong henerasyon po ng mga Pilipino? For example, yung mga batang Pilipino po para kahit papaano ay mas maganda po yung kinabukasan nila.
Yung mga bata.
Opo.
Ay, kailangan yung kundi na. Sila. Mag-aaral, gano'n.
Parang
Okay.
parang kailangan po ng mas maayos na edukasyon, ganun po. Tsaka mga programa po para ma-improve po yung kakayahan po nila. So, ano po yung masasabi nyo sa mga Pilipinong nagsasabi na tamad ang mga Pilipino?
Hindi naman.
Ano po yung masasabi nyo po sa kanila?
Masipag, mga Pilipino. Masipag sila.
So, ayun po. Maraming salamat po kuya.
Sige.
Oh, so the closest theory to my knowledge is what we call as the luxury unemployment hypothesis. And then from the term itself, it's called luxury unemployment. Ibig sabihin, ang mga unemployed daw ay in a luxurious position. And this is in the context of a developing country, right? So it's a 1980s concept, right? Udall and Sinclair. And I know this by heart because it's part of my dissertation. Although what the luxury unemployment hypothesis says is that in periods of in difficult periods, right, or in developing countries, uh, where there are poor social protection, right, poor to no social assistance mechanisms, and low household savings, your households can't afford to be unemployed, right? Kasi wala silang kita. So dapat magtatrabaho sila on a daily basis para sila makasurvive. So ang argument ni Udall and Sinclair, sabi niya, yung mga hindi nagtatrabaho or yung mga unemployed, ibig sabihin, afford nila maging unemployed kasi hindi sila nagtatrabaho. Right? Sabi ni Udall and Sinclair, ang luxury unemployment daw, which is more common among developing countries, they suggest, okay, ay driven uh, by those who just are not working because wages are not enough for them, right? And so, basically, yung sa madaling sabi, kapag may recession at wala kang trabaho, hindi necessarily magiging unemployed ka kasi nga wala ka namang savings. Hindi ka talaga makakasurvive kung hindi ka nagtatrabaho. So usually, mag-transition ka to some kind of job, right? Some kind of informal job. At yung mga natitira lang na unemployed, yung mga may afford lang. Kasi kung may savings ka, edi pwede kang mabuhay kahit na wala kang trabaho. Kung may kung may social assistance mechanisms ka, edi pwede kang mabuhay kahit na wala kang trabaho. So so to in that theory, right, in that hypothesis, right, unemployment is reserved for those who are who have the capacity and the ability to be unemployed, right? Although that's not really pointing to laziness. It doesn't hit on laziness in the entire publication of that article, and so I feel like it's always unfair when more recent scholars attribute the luxury unemployment hypothesis to people who are leisure bingers. But apart from that, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know any other concept. No, but it's important to note that there is already more of like a global consensus that ang kahirapan, right, poverty and inequality are not generally, right? Generally, they're not consequences of character flaws of the poor, right, or of the disadvantaged. Ibig sabihin, kung mahirap ang tao, hindi yan generally because of their character flaws. Hindi yan dahil tamad sila, hindi yan dahil uneducated sila, but it's because of really how labor markets are structured, right? And how wages are structured. And so I think it's lazy, right, also for politicians to say, or for politicians, for academics, for anyone to say that okay, the poor are poor because they're lazy or they're not really working. So I think that's not the case, right? In fact, empirical studies would confirm the role, the positive role of perceived employment prospects in actual effort. So naggawa ng experiment ay in a recent publication, tinitignan ano ba yung actual effort ng mga estudyante sa kanilang pag-aaral. Well, kapag ka pala mas madami yung employment prospects, ibig sabihin the 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 opportunities to land a job are better and higher, the more effort that they exert. Sorry. And so actually that's the opposite, right? May yung causality mo magkaiba na. Kasi it's now it's now um it's now opportunities that drive effort and not only effort that's driving opportunities, right? And so the idea of laziness in economic economic models, I think it's not that sophisticated yet, and properly developed. Right, to the best of my knowledge, it's only the luxury unemployment hypothesis that is associated with this. But other than that, um, I don't think that laziness is a large part. Of course, there is of course some laziness, uh, uh, in some sectors of the economy, but in general, I don't think it really explains the big social problems that we have right now. In general, no. I mean, no in the a qualified no, right? No, number one is that of course you never can generalize, right? You never can say walang mahirap na hindi tamad or something, right? You can't make that generalization in the same way that you can't say lahat ng mga mayayaman ay masipag, right? We never can make these generalizations. But number two, it's really no studies or no data at all point to laziness as a cause. Right? Maybe it's because of the absence of studies in investigating this, but also it's not really. I don't think it's really the biggest determinant of why of why conditions, social conditions, are poor or are stagnating. I don't think in general it's because of that laziness factor. Pag ganito yung kalagayan, do we mean why are the poor poor? Right? So why are the poor poor? Depends on many political factors as well, right? Not only economic, but also why is inequality large? Also a different question, right? Or why are social living standards stagnating? Right? Also a different different issue, right? Which has different causes. Um, or is it because, or is it what's the issue? Is it lack of bargaining power, lack of power of the workers? And so, eh, different conditions in the economy require different diagnoses. And so, yeah, if the question is laziness a part of the social ills? In general, I don't think so. In general, I don't think there is a quantifiable, uh, objective way to say that X% of the problems that we have right now is because of laziness. And if that's the case, then how does one correct that? Right? I would still always point to the imbalance of power, right? Imbalance of powers between, in this case, workers and firms. Imbalance of powers uh, uh, between not imbalance of powers, but imbalance of opportunities, for instance, between formal and informal economy workers, and also wage disparities, right? Which is, of course, a consequence of the imbalance of powers that I was talking about earlier. And so, if one corrects that, right, one corrects that imbalance, then you start seeing good things to happen. Right? You start governments become less and less concerned about increasing minimum wages, and they just should right? Maybe start questioning abolishing regional wage boards, for instance, right? Try to accelerate that wage convergence across different regions. um, and so if you think about labor is such a boring topic for the government, right? Like in the um, Bongbong Marcos's 8-point socio-economic agenda or something. It's so weird. It's so weird. But they said there, how do we create quality jobs, right? So that's the I think point number 5 or so. Create quality jobs, and how do they create quality jobs? Number one, they said let's increase spending in research and development, and number two, let's invest in uh, let's invest in digital economy. It's like what? That's not what quality jobs are, right? That's not. That's not really how to create quality jobs because, in fact, uh, sabi sila, no, increase mo daw ang digital economy mo. Eh, ang digital economy workers mo nga, yung Grab workers mo, yung Food Panda workers mo, sila nga yung madaming complaints against their employers. And so, ang sasabihin mo, to create quality jobs, i-improve mo pa yung, invest mo pa yung digital economy mo. So, it doesn't, the causality in the government's thinking right now does not make sense to me, right? And so, how does one create quality jobs? Really focusing on the conditions of the informally employed because they're the ones who are in poor quality jobs, yung mga contractual. We heard nothing about contractualization from the socio-economic agenda. We heard nothing about unionization. We heard nothing about minimum wages. We heard nothing that would improve the working conditions and provide quality jobs, no matter how they define it. Right? Instead, we got bucket list of research and development and digital economy. And so I think this government, the government has its head in the wrong direction in terms of creating quality jobs. Of course, these were developed by former colleagues and professors of mine, and I tell them directly, this is wrong. This is not the way to go about it. But I'm just a voice in the wilderness.
Ayon nga sa akda ni Rizal na the indolence of the Filipino, we shall examine the causes. Man is not a brute, he is not a machine. His object is not merely to produce, his object is to seek happiness for himself. Tamad o kulang sa oportunidad? Ito ang tanong na dapat muna nating pagnilay-nilayan bago natin sambitin ang ating opinyon ukol sa nosyon ng katamaran o sa rason sa likod ng kahirapan ng mga Pilipino. Nararapat muna nating suriin ang katayuan ng mga Pilipino, ang mga issue at problemang pumapalibot sa kanila, ang kalagayan ng ating bayan, at ang mga sosyal, politikal, maging ekonomikong mga isyong kinahaharap ng ating bayan at ng sambayan ng Pilipino. Madaling sabihin kaya hindi umuunlad ang buhay ng mga Pilipino dahil tamad sila. Ngunit mahirap itong patunayan dahil ang katotohanan, ibinibigay ng karamihan ng mga Pilipino ang lahat ng makakaya nila para lamang matamasa nila ang magandang buhay na inaasam ng karamihan. Handa nilang ibuhos ang kanilang oras at enerhiya at ialay ang kanilang pawis at lakas. Ngunit kadalasan, kinakapos pa rin sila ng sapat na resources at suporta. Mga resources, suporta, programa at oportunidad na sana'y tutulong at aakay sa kanila upang mapabuti ang kanilang buhay.
Hindi tamad ang mga Pilipino po.
Ang siyang sigaw ng mga manggagawang Pilipino. Ito si Antonio Balanon III mula sa La Paginaria de Rizal at ito ang X4A Files Interviews.